For the first time in more than a decade, Israel has a new prime minister. Naftali Bennett was sworn in on Sunday. A coalition of 8 parties unseated the longtime Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, including Bennett's own right-wing nationalist party and the first Arab party to sit in a coalition. So how long can a coalition with deep ideological differences actually survive? And how much will get done? Haviv Gur is a political correspondent and a senior analyst with the Times of Israel. And Mr. Gur, thank you very much for staying up late to talk to Power and Politics. I want to start with the man leading this coalition. You wrote an in-depth piece about Naftali Bennett. What do people need to know about Israel's new prime minister?
Israel's new prime minister is, in a sense, the opposite of the last prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who spent 12 years really bolstering and strengthening the status quo, who avoided armed conflict. The armed conflict obviously makes the news, but what you don't see is that the past decade for Israel has actually seen the least conflict and the least death, violent death in any kind of conflict of Israel's history. And so Netanyahu is this very staid and solid person. Naftali Bennett is a study in contrast in that sense. He's a former commando. He spent 6 years in the army in a very elite units. He founded an internet company at the age of 27, a tech company, and sold it 6 years later for $145 million. He entered politics, spent about 6-7 years as an activist, and then suddenly burst onto national politics as the economy minister, one of the more senior cabinet positions. So this is a man with a meteoric rise, several short but very successful careers, and a man who is very active, gets things done, and believes in engaging with the problem and being very, very active. So I think we're going to see a lot of movement. A lot of politics will happen now. We're out of the sort of quiet period of Netanyahu, even though people don't usually think of it that way. Netanyahu has actually been a pretty staid custodian of national affairs in Israel.
And then by contrast, Naftali Bennett has insisted, for instance, there must never be a fully fledged Palestinian state. He has championed settlers, West Bank settlers, once led the council representing them. What does this mean for what is likely to come?
Right. Well, on the one hand, we have a much more right-wing prime minister on paper. And Naftali Bennett has criticized Netanyahu from the right flank of Netanyahu for years. When he represented the Yesha Council, the representative council of the settlements, he actually had a public fight in 2010 with Netanyahu and demanded that Netanyahu resign for the settlement freeze that Netanyahu carried out at the time. But at the same time, he's part of something called the parity government. It's a unity government in which the center left has a veto on every major government decision. And that's a fascinating and very different kind of government from what Israelis are used to and from what most democracies are used to. Naftali Bennett can't annex settlements. Naftali Bennett can't expand settlements in any significant way without his left-wing partners agreeing, and of course they won't agree. He also can't pull out of the West Bank and sign a peace deal for 2 states because the right-wing half of the government won't agree. So this is a government that's going to shun those kinds of issues, the really big issues that people deeply disagree on and that are the subject of Israel's big culture wars, and will focus on economy, transportation, schools, things that don't divide Israelis.
Now, the government itself is made up of a bunch of different groups, and coalitions are nothing new to Israel or Israeli politics, certainly. But because there are people from the right and the left, there's an Arab political party as well that's a small part of this government. What does it do to the stability of the government?
The short answer is we don't know. There has never been a government like this. There's never been a government with parties that are that far right sitting with parties that are that far left. The progressive left edge of Israeli politics is in the coalition. The Arab Party you mentioned is fascinating because on the one hand, it's considered very left-wing in the sense that it's pro-Palestinian state, and it's also a party that's very concerned with the concerns of minorities and of the Arab minorities. On social issues, it's very, very conservative. It's an Islamist conservative party. I mean, ultra-conservative. I mean, it has decided that it will veto veto any gay rights legislation that comes through this government. And so there's also, this socially conservative Muslim party sitting with very progressive Jewish parties, eager, by the way, led by an openly gay man who heads the Meretz party. And so there's so many dividing lines in this government. I suspect that this government won't get anything done on those big divisive issues. Whether the government can survive those kinds of divides is anybody's guess. We've never had anything like it.
Yeah, I suppose that's the big question. Is this government still going to exist a year from now?
There's good reason to think it will, by the way. One reason to think it will is that Netanyahu has promised not to go anywhere. And he said today he's planning his comeback to save Israel from this terrible government and the terrible prime minister, as he put it. Having Netanyahu there in the wings is what built this strange coalition. And so as long as he sticks around, it's quite possible that these people will find good cause to stay together. Time will tell. We're in uncharted waters for Israeli politics.
I do want to ask you one more question about Naftali Bennett, the new prime minister. He spent a short amount of time in Montreal, here in Canada. What was the connection there?
His father just had work. It was a work thing. He was a very, very young child. It's an interesting contrast. Benjamin Netanyahu was his boss for a couple of years. Naftali Bennett was actually a chief of staff and a very important political aide to Netanyahu between 2006 and 2008. And Netanyahu, of course, has wonderful English and spent his high school years and got a degree at MIT in the United States. And one of the things that Netanyahu liked about Bennett was that his parents come from San Francisco. He had a little bit of time in America. He had a little bit of time in Canada. His English is decent. But it was all when he was very young, so his English isn't quite as good as Netanyahu. You see the Canadian and American connection in Bennett on issues that step outside of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where he's quite liberal. He's quite liberal on gay rights issues, even though he's an Orthodox religious man. He is as open as the religious community is on issues of gay rights and on issues of economics and personal freedoms and things like that. So there is something there. There is a connection there, a cultural connection.
Mr. Gur, thank you so much for your time this evening. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.